Yena, thunder crashed in the distance and left echoes humming through the cave. I looked at the naked stranger lying asleep beside me. Lightning flickered, illuminating his muscular body only in glimpses. He was covered in mud and blood, and though in human form now, he still looked wild and monstrous. I'd never found myself lying beside any naked man before in my life, let alone a huge, gorgeous stranger who nearly bled to death just hours ago. I tried to study his face in the flickering dark. He had thick, dark eyebrows over deep-set eyes and a hard, serious jaw. His face was unshaven, darkly shadowed with a short, scruffy beard. I watched his strong chest lifting and lowering with the shallow breaths of deep sleep, and felt my mouth start to water. I had taken my eyes off him, so I turned to watch the storm. The torrential rain was unreal, whipping past the mouth of the cave in sheets. Tree branches were snapping under violent winds. I heard them breaking off and crashing down the mountainside. I came out here today for a camping trip with some classmates. Or so I was told. One of the only normal human girls at the Werewolf Noble Academy. I was at the bottom of the social order from the start. But even worse than that, just about everyone at school, including my adoptive brother Evan, picked on me for being fat. So I couldn't believe my luck when a few beautiful girls from one of my classes invited me to go camping on the mountain with them this weekend. But once we arrived in the forest, they ditched me at the edge of a cliff and left me there, stranded. By the time I managed to climb back down to the main road, I found my phone was dead. So I couldn't call for help. Then, as I started down the road on foot, a blanket of dark clouds covered the sky. I tasted moisture in the air, and just a moment later, a sudden downpour struck the mountain. I hurried down the road searching desperately for shelter, when I came upon a wolf lying injured beside the road. He was battered and unconscious, with a gash on his front leg. A crimson puddle was growing around him, starting to pull him down into the wet earth. I picked my way over to where he lay. His breath was slow and ragged. I spotted the cave and wasted no time. I carried him over the rocks, drenching my clothes in his blood, and got us both inside. I tore apart my jacket and used the fabric to wrap his leg. When it seemed the bleeding had stopped, I let myself collapse beside him, exhausted. We slept for some time, and when I woke later in the night, the wolf was gone. In its place was the hulking form of the beautiful stranger. The makeshift bandages had fallen off. Lying on his side next to me, I could feel his hot breath on my skin, and couldn't help but inch my body closer to his. Turning away from the mouth of the cave, I started watching the stranger again, and noticed the gash on his shoulder had opened back up and was shimmering with fresh, wet blood. I reached out and touched the wound gently. He drew in a sharp inhale. I couldn't pull my hand away. The intense heat of his body pulsed into my fingers, tingling up my arm and flooding my whole body with warmth. He shifted his weight toward me, and my fingers sank into the hot, bleeding wound. He let out a deep growl. I ran my bloodied fingertips across his chest. It was caked with mud that matted into a thick, rough patch of hair. He brought his face in close and hovered his lips close to mine, and the stranger was gone. I drew in a long, deep breath. The smell of the stranger lingered. I noticed, hardly believing the sharpness of my senses, that he'd left two distinct scents behind, the smell of the wolf and the smell of the man. I wiped my face with my hands, smelling the metal and mineral scents of blood and earth on them. Something had changed. Yes, I lost my virginity in the middle of the strangest night of my life. But it wasn't just that. I felt awake and alive. I stood and stretched. I was warm and relaxed, with an energy pulsing through me that I'd never felt before. Then, a voice spoke, not aloud. Somehow, it came from within. At first, it was like a whisper. "It's because you've transformed," the voice was saying. I walked out of the cave, into damp, yellow sunlight. "You're a wolf," the voice continued, growing louder, or more like, "You have a wolf inside of you." "That's me. You can call me Lily." Was I going crazy? I had never heard a voice like this before. But it didn't feel crazy. Lily. Her voice almost sounded like my own, except it was lighter, happier. "It's because we're two sides of one soul," she said. "I've been with you all along and always will be. I was just waiting for you to find your power." "You'll see, I'll explain everything." 18 years. 18 years I'd been just a normal human, knowing something was missing from my life. And now, I found it. I descended the mountain and followed a trickling stream to the river. I traveled quickly, surprisingly sure-footed on the soft ground. I knelt at the river's edge and drank and washed my face and hands. My shirt was stiff with dried blood. I rinsed it, wrung it out, and put it back on wet. It clung to my body and sent a chill down my spine. Combing the grass out of my hair, I listened to Lily. Her voice was getting clearer. She told me I was different from the girls at school. Even more powerful. With abilities I wouldn't yet believe if she told me. It sounded pretty outrageous. She said my powers were unlocked when I connected with my fated mate, and that now I'd grow into my true self, a peerless beauty with ancient lineage more noble than the ruling royal family. I laughed. Fated mate, more noble than the Lycan king, a peerless beauty. I'd been self-conscious about my appearance forever. It didn't help that when we were kids, Evan was always pinching and poking the soft flesh on my arms, making jokes, and calling me chubby. Yena. Yena, as if I had conjured him with that thought. Evan suddenly appeared, running toward me. "Evan, what are you doing here?" He was in his practice gear, wearing a filthy white jersey over shoulder pads and holding his football helmet in one hand. "What are you doing?" He had a strange look on his face. "What's wrong?" I asked. He took a step back, met my eyes briefly, then looked away. "I was calling you last night," he said. Are you, what hap?" He trailed off mid-word and frowned, staring at my clothes. "I'm sorry, my phone died," I said. Before I could continue, he interrupted. "Just call me later," he mumbled. "I have to." He turned and sprinted away. His face and ears were flushed. I heard Lily's voice. "What don't you understand? He's nervous because you're beautiful, Evan. My brother, who taunted me about my weight my whole life. You'll see," she said, laughing. I crossed my arms and hugged my curves, feeling strangely comfortable in my body. If Lily was right, maybe I would become more beautiful in time. But already, everything had changed. I followed Evan from the river down toward campus and met him by the football field, where he was packing up his stuff. He motioned for me to follow him. I opened my mouth to say something, but he turned and yelled to his team that he wanted them to show up early for the next practice. Evan was the team captain, and he loved to show off, bossing the other guys around whenever he had a chance, especially if there was any kind of audience there to watch. He stayed a few steps ahead of me as we walked home. Evan was like that sometimes, ignoring me. Too cool. But I have to admit that overall, he's been a good brother to me. I know he has a good heart. He's always been embarrassed to be the fat girl's big brother, especially since he's always been popular. But he's been there for me when I needed him. And he does nice things to surprise me, remind me he cares. Like buying my favorite chocolates for me and sneaking them into my bag when I'm not looking. I had to hurry to keep up with Evan, but found that I actually felt very light-footed, and the quick pace was easy. I couldn't help but notice that my hips felt sexier too, as they swayed with each step. I remembered what Lily said about my becoming more beautiful. It still seemed like a fantasy, but I couldn't deny I felt different in my body today. Could this really be all because I had sex with that werewolf? Last night, the wolf inside me roused at the mere thought of him. My heart started pounding, and not because I was walking fast. Lily didn't speak to me in my mind, but I felt her in my body, and I remembered the smell of that incredible man, the glow of his piercing, green eyes. Even in that awful condition, with bruises on his face and his body nearly torn to pieces, he was the most handsome man I'd ever seen. Saturday, Vetteen, Evan's mom cooked us dinner, a big meal of meat, potatoes, and vegetable stew, which I really needed after the night I'd had. Tina was a great cook, so I didn't mind living at home with her and Peter, my adoptive parents, while starting my freshman year. Are you all right, Yana? Tina was looking at me with concern in her eyes. Oh, I said, clearing my throat. Yeah, just hungry. The camping trip was pretty tiring, she nodded. I was relieved she didn't keep pushing, asking about any changes she might have noticed in me. When my mother died, she left me with Tina, who was her best friend. I grew up with her family, and they treated me well. I was so grateful when she told me she and Peter would pay for my education, and I enrolled at the Werewolf Noble Academy a year behind Evan. I was already used to being an outsider before I started at WNA. I'd always been picked on for being fat, and I learned a long time ago I couldn't let it affect me. The noble werewolves at school looked down on me in a new way, though, and if this weekend was any indication, they were more savage bullies than I had expected. I glanced at Peter. He was staring absently at his plate while gnawing on a big piece of meat, paying no attention to any of us at all. He'd been working a lot of late nights recently, and it seemed like something at work might have been troubling him. I ate fast and escaped upstairs to my room. My thoughts kept floating back to the stranger. I wondered if I would ever see him again. I was heading into the elevator in the arts building when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Well, the voice said. I turned around. It was Karen, one of the girls that had stranded me on the mountain. I pushed the button, but she stepped into the elevator behind me before the door closed. If it isn't Big Yenna, Karen continued. Looks like you survived that big hike down the mountain. That's almost impressive. She bared her perfect white teeth in a cruel and self-satisfied grin. Her two lackeys crowded into the elevator and flanked her on both sides. I couldn't think of anything to say. What's wrong? Big girl, lose your voice up there on the mountain. Karen giggled at her own stupid joke, then looked to the other girls for validation. They laughed on cue. The elevator door started to slide closed. Hey, someone stuck their foot against the door, and it halted to a stop with a metallic thud. Just leave her alone. Okay? It was Susan, my one and only friend on this campus. I had never been happier to see her. Karen turned to Susan and quipped, "Oh, here to save your fat friend." "Yena's my friend, period," Susan said. "And I don't know why you're so obsessed with tormenting her, but seriously, get a life." Susan shoved past the girls, grabbed my wrist, and pulled me out of the elevator. The door rolled closed, leaving the girls inside. "Come on," Susan said, and we ducked into the first-floor library. We found an empty reading room and sat at a big wooden table. She told me she'd heard about what the girls did to me on the mountain and asked if I was okay. I told her about my night, about the wolf, and the man he turned into. Her jaw nearly hit the floor when I told her about the sex. "Honestly," she said, "I am so jealous. He sounds hot." I shook my head and laughed. It sounds crazy, but I almost want to thank those stupid whores who left me in the woods, because that night turned out to be the most amazing thing that's ever happened in my whole life. Susan squeezed my hand. "Okay," she said, "this doesn't really compare with your thing, but I have some news too, and I can't hold it in any longer." "What?" I asked. They just announced that Prince Nolan is coming here next week to choose his future Luna. She squealed with excitement. Wow, I said. Susan had told me more than a few times about her dream to marry Nolan, the eldest prince in the Lycan royal family. That would mean someday she'd be Luna Queen. You have to help me, she pleaded, her eyes wide. Help you? How? Make me a dress. He's coming to the full moon ball here on campus, and he's going to make his selection at the dance. And well, you know my parents probably couldn't give me money for a dress. At least not one that would be good enough to catch his attention. Of course, I said. Susan and her family came from a noble werewolf lineage, but she confided in me recently that their beautiful mansion was just about all her parents had in the world. They had noble titles and enjoyed the social life of the aristocracy, but privately were pretty much broke. Make it red, she added with a smile. Blood red. Sure, I said. I'd do anything for you, you know that. On that note, she replied, there's just one other thing. I was hoping that maybe you could come with me. Oh, I was a little surprised. Why, you know I'm not really interested in all that. Marrying a prince really wasn't the life I was looking for. I wanted a career in fashion, maybe even to be famous for my designs someday. But Susan had been obsessed with Prince Nolan ever since she saw him once at a royal dinner. First of all, she said, how could anyone not be interested in Prince Nolan? I swear to the goddess he is absolutely perfect. I raised an eyebrow at her. Being handsome was just part of a prince's job description. I couldn't really imagine this one being anything spectacular. When you see him, you'll know what I mean, she continued. And please, just come to support me. I'll be so nervous. Okay, I conceded with a sigh. But I thought you had to be a virgin to be eligible for the selection party. And remember that other thing we were just talking about. Who cares? She asked, shrugging her shoulders. If you don't tell anyone, no one will know. She winked at me and smiled. The week went by in a flash, and next thing I knew, Susan and I were walking into the dance hall for the full moon ball. The stage was lined with a red carpet that flowed down a few steps to the center of a well-polished dance floor. Golden chandeliers were heavy with candles that lit the room with a warm white glow. There were huge bouquets of red roses everywhere. A band was playing quietly at one end of the stage. The conductor was leading them to a slow tempo, waving his arms in a way that made them look boneless. Thank you, Susan said to me. Thank you for this amazing dress. I knew you were good, but this is really next level. She did look amazing. The dress had a fitted bodice onto which I'd hand-sewn what felt like a million garnet-colored beads that shimmered in the candlelight and almost looked alive. The skirt was crimson, floor-length with a slit-up one leg that stopped just below the knee. It was nothing, I replied, but the pale purple circles under my eyes betrayed that I'd been pulling long nights this week, and my fingers were covered in needle pricks. The other girls in attendance all looked gorgeous. Their dresses were designer, obviously expensive and ornate. I spotted Karen, who was wearing a long lace gown as bright white as her big teeth. I fidgeted with my own dress, which I'd made using scraps left over from a school project. It was black, cut in layers, and draped in a way that flattered my hourglass curves, with long sleeves and a gold lace overskirt. The hall was packed. People were clustered together, whispering excitedly. I followed Susan to where the concubine selection party was preparing for the prince's arrival. To my surprise, there were a few human girls in the group, which was otherwise made up of noble female werewolves. Unlike me, though, they were at least noble humans. They don't have much hope for actually being chosen, Susan whispered to me, eyeing the human girls. But I guess they just want to try their luck. Good for them. As far as I knew, only Lycans and werewolves had ever inhabited the royal palace. It was hard to imagine a prince or king choosing a human mate. They married female werewolves from noble bloodlines. That's just the way it was. Susan had insisted on wearing red lipstick that night for the first time. But now she kept asking me to check and see if any had gotten on her teeth. "You look perfect," I told her. I gave her shoulder an encouraging squeeze. I noticed Karen watching us, whispering to her friends and snickering. She liked to make fun of our friendship, calling me Susan's sidekick or assistant. I didn't really care, especially that night. I was just there to support my best friend. A sudden trumpet tune sounded. The ceremony was about to start. The conductor turned to face the crowd and called out in a loud voice, "I present to you, heir to the Lycan throne, Prince Nolan." The crowd went crazy as the prince walked out onto the stage. 3 other tall and handsome men followed him, walking in perfect unison. All of them were dressed in black suits. But the prince stood out easily at the front of the pack. Nolan was indeed shockingly handsome, with dark features and a stern posture that commanded authority. As he descended the stairs, he turned to look in our direction, and for a brief moment we locked eyes. My body reacted before my mind could form a complete thought. I felt sick, faint, thrilled, and full of dread all at once. Nolan's eyes were dark green, deep-set, and intense. They looked right into my soul. I knew, in that instant, it was him, the stranger. But the prince looked away, and I took a deep breath, telling myself I had to be mistaken. The bloodied werewolf that fucked me in a cave last week could not be the same man I saw before me now. A stately royal with perfect posture, neat hair, and chiseled cheekbones. But, I remembered, the stranger's features had been swollen from his injuries. Maybe I had touched those cheekbones when they were buried under bruises. I couldn't be sure. Head. What? The selection party was like a pageant. The girls took the stage for only a few minutes each, walking slowly to show off their bodies. The prince watched from below center stage, with his attendants seated beside and behind him. Some of us passed through our turns quickly. Others showed off talents, offering short performances for the crowd. One, a dancer, turned a beautiful pirouette. A few others attempted musical performances that ranged from dull to downright embarrassing. Susan was last on stage. She sang a tune I'd heard her practice before. In a clear, sweet soprano, she wowed the audience with a short melody and earned enthusiastic applause. I'd asked Evan to meet me here with flowers so we could bring them to Susan after her performance and act like her fans. I thought it might help her odds of attracting Nolan's attention. Evan met me near the stage, and we rushed over to Susan, as planned, throwing wildflower bouquets at her feet while she bowed before the crowd. The prince clapped politely. The neutral expression on his face had not changed once since his arrival. The applause died down. Susan and I took our places, lined up on stage in a row with the other contenders. The prince stood and walked up the steps to the stage. Whispers ran through the anxious crowd. All eyes were on Susan, who trembled beside me. The prince paced the stage slowly. He came to a stop in front of me and Susan. Then, inexplicably, he reached out and touched my hand. It felt like a fire ignited inside me. Before I could process what was happening, the prince pulled me forward. We faced the crowd, hand in hand. "Thank you all for coming to the full moon ball," he announced. His voice was deep and commanding. "I believe," he continued, "that I have found my future Luna." I couldn't understand what was happening. I tried to pull my hand free from Nolan's, but he held on tight. Looking at him standing there, his princely stature and simple confidence gave him an appearance of softness and grace. But his grip revealed an incredible, unmovable strength. I stood beside him helpless for what was probably seconds, but felt like an eternity. The crowd began to stir and grumble. I turned to Susan. All the color had drained from her face. One of the prince's men paced over to us, carrying a golden laurel crown studded with sparkling emeralds atop a red velvet pillow. Nolan finally released my hand. He took the crown from the attendant and turned to face me, lifting it over my head. Suddenly, a blur of red rushed past me. Susan stormed forward on the stage, stood at its edge, and spun to face us. Her face was no longer pale, but flushed red with anger, matching the crimson glow of the glass beads on her gown. "My lord," she said, her voice shaky and loud, "there is something about Yena that you should know." My stomach sank. This could not be good. The crowd fell silent, as if everyone were holding their breath. Evan, still near the stage, stepped forward. "Susan," he said, his voice echoed in the now eerily quiet hall. "What are you doing?" Susan's eyes, wide with rage, were fixed on me. "My dear friend Yena," she continued, her volume increasing with every word, "has a dirty little secret. She told me she had a one-night stand with a rogue wolf just last week. She's no longer a virgin." All the air left my lungs. I felt like I'd been punched, over and over again, by a swinging pendulum I couldn't get out from under. Every moment, the reality of this situation felt more and more unbearable. I began to shake. My legs felt as though they were about to go limp. Everyone was looking at me. Then I was hit with a wave of that specific kind of anxiety I felt often in public. The shame about my weight, my appearance, and had the strange thought that if I'd have known this would happen tonight, I would have started a diet earlier in the week. Nolan threaded my arm through his. I felt like I would faint. I leaned on him without meaning to, and worried my weight would make him stumble sideways. But his only reaction was to wrap a strong arm around my shoulders, steadying me. Was he really not worried about my weight at all? Why had he chosen me? The chatter in the crowd was growing into an uproar. I never wanted this. I never asked for it. I didn't even want to come to the ball in the first place. I would have been sprinting for the door in that moment if I'd been able to. But Nolan had me in a vice grip, as if he knew I might try to escape. The glares from the crowd, the angry faces, the voices starting to call out in protest. It was overwhelming. My ears started ringing. And then I heard Lily's whisper, "Honey, he's completely smitten with you." My heart was beating out of my chest. Not possible. I thought, he's a prince, a lichen. He'll be king someday, and I don't belong with him. I'm just a fat girl, and he's beyond out of my league. "You're more than that," Lily said. "You're charming and beautiful, and meant for greatness. This prince shows wisdom and vision, picking you out of the crowd." I couldn't believe it. "Yes," Lily insisted. "It's true, you're much more beautiful than Susan, who just revealed what a graceless bitch she really is. And trust me, the prince loves you. I know it to be true." I couldn't keep arguing with the voice in my head. The world around me was unraveling. The prince kept hold of me and held his head up high. Susan had turned to the crowd and was yelling something I couldn't make out amidst the commotion below. Evan's voice rose above the others. He wanted to defend my honor. "Susan," he cried out again, "I won't allow you to slander my sister. She would never do such a thing." Evan was tall and handsome, and tonight had dressed in a navy jacket that brought out the blue in his eyes. He'd coiffed his thick brown hair neatly, but as he stood there before the stage pleading my case, he ran an anxious hand through it and turned it into a big mess. "And did you forget," he continued, "that she gave you the very clothes on your back? She was up all night making that damn dress for you. What are you doing?" My heart was breaking for Evan. He was trying to protect his little sister, but he couldn't protect me from this. It's a serious crime in our world to claim falsely to be a virgin when entering an election for marriage to a royal. I didn't want to see the look on Evan's face when he found out that what Susan had said was actually true. When he found out what I'd done, hot tears began to roll down my cheeks. Never before had I actually cried in the face of a bully. But I'd never before been betrayed like this. Usually the bully was someone like Karen, not someone I trusted. Someone I thought was my friend. Silence. The prince's voice boomed with impossible volume, sending a hush over the crowd. Susan's anger visibly deflated. She took one nervous step backward, down the center stage stairs. I would have preferred, Nolan continued, to keep this information private between myself and my betrothed. But since this person, he glared at Susan, who stared up at him in awe and took another hesitant step backwards down the stairs, is attempting to assassinate her character, I must share, in defense of my new bride, something that will help you all understand why I have chosen her. He paused. The crowd was still and silent. It was I who spent that night with Yena, he said, startling the crowd into a collective gasp. She was a virgin before we met, and the fault is mine that I took her innocence before I promised her marriage. Nolan looked me in the eye. I didn't see any warmth or affection there, no love. Like Lily claimed he felt for me. His green eyes were flecked with gold and amber that glimmered in the candlelight. I felt suddenly vulnerable every time I met this man's gaze, like he was reading my thoughts, or could sense what I was feeling. But looking back into his eyes, I saw only power and authority, and some sort of darkness that scared me just a little and turned me on a lot. I didn't come here tonight, he said, turning back to the crowd, to choose a concubine. I came here for one reason only, to find the girl who saved my life and make her my queen. He took hold of my hand once again. I was attacked last week by rogue wolves who baited me into the woods. I was surrounded and badly outnumbered. We fought for hours before I managed to escape, but I was fatally wounded. Every person in the audience was slack-jawed, hanging on to his every word. I had been poisoned. My ribs were broken, and my arm was nearly severed. I was alone on the mountain, but Yena saved me. I felt Evan's eyes on me, but couldn't bring myself to look at him. She found me, Nolan continued, took me to safety, treated my injuries, and somehow brought me back to life. I knew it. I knew it was him. Without her, I would be dead. My family would be left without an heir to the throne, never even knowing what happened to me. My corpse would have been buried in the mountainside, or picked apart and eaten by whichever scavenging creature first smelled my rotting flesh. The crowd was stunned, and so was I. The pieces were all finally clicking together. In my mind, I had actually had a shameless nightstand with a prince, and not just any prince, the heir to the Lycan throne. But she's a human, not a wolf. How can she possibly marry a Lycan? It was Karen. She asked her question loudly, but with what could be mistaken for a polite and reverent tone. She flashed me a cruel, toothy smile before stepping back into the crowd of girls that were now encircling me and Nolan on the stage. Whispers coursed through the audience. Then a single voice rang out from the far end of the hall, crying, "This fat human girl has tricked and seduced our prince." The crowd roared in outrage. Another anonymous voice shouted, "The Gamma warriors should arrest her, lock her up at once." A cry of support rang out amongst the nobles. The armed guards posted at the entrance paced a few steps forward into the hall. They were members of the King's Guard, known as Gamma Warriors, and they were heavily armed. I swallowed hard. My palms were sweaty. Nolan smirked at the crowd. He withdrew his hand from mine, reached up, and ran it through my hair, letting a long golden curl slide through his fingers as it pulled back up in recoil. His touch was not only familiar, it was electric. I looked into his eyes. They were entrancing, but unreadable, like the glassy surface of deep waters. I felt Lily, not her voice in my head. I felt something stirring inside me. It hurt. It hurt really bad, actually. Everywhere. My lungs felt like they might explode. I gasped, but before I could cry out in pain, the transformation had already happened. I was on all fours. The smell of roses was suddenly overwhelming. The light was different, somehow brighter and sharper, and I looked down at my paws. The crowd was howling with laughter. Panicked, I paced backward, only to bump into the circle of girls from the selection party. I looked up at them, way up. Their faces showed an array of emotions. Amazed, amused, and disgusted. I paced forward. Susan was there on the steps. She had 1,000-yard stare, like she'd just been through hell and back. She was well beyond shocked. It really happened. I was a wolf, but my legs were thick and short, unlike those of any other wolf I'd ever seen, and my paws were round and soft. My fur was also an inexplicable shade of light gold, just a little lighter than my blonde human hair. I'd never heard of a golden wolf, not in today's world. I read about one once, though, in a history book, about a rare and noble breed of ancient wolves. I leaned into Nolan. He was all I had in this moment. I had just transformed into an apex predator, and I never felt more insecure in my life. Nolan caressed the top of my head, stroking my soft fur. I couldn't help but feel a little comforted. The corners of his mouth curled up in a wicked smile. Susan lost her shit. She pulled off her shoes and threw one of them at me. Nolan stepped in front of me. His face was still unchanged, but his energy was decisive, and Susan felt it. She staggered backwards, letting out a breathy, sarcastic laugh. "You fucking whore," she grumbled. "Secret werewolf bitch whore." She turned and sprinted for the exit. The crowd parted, and in an instant she was through the great oak doors and out of sight. I tried to leap forward to chase after her, but Nolan held me back, grabbing hard at the scruff of my neck. I struggled against him and somehow managed to shift back into human form. My gown was crumpled and ripped in a few places. Every muscle in my body ached. I rose from the floor. "Be glad you're through with her," Nolan said to me quietly. "She's a traitor, not a suitable friend for future royalty." His tone was severe and unapologetic. He waved at his attendants, who in turn gave some discreet gesture to the Gamma warriors. And just like that, it was all over. The guards were escorting everyone out of the hall, including Evan. I glimpsed his blue jacket as he struggled against the moving crowd, trying to maneuver his way back to me. I turned away and took hold of the prince's outstretched hand. "Ha Buen." Nolan pulled me into a little private room while the hall was being cleared. He said he wanted to explain. I was still trying to get my bearings in my body again. I sat down and ran my fingers through my tangled hair and started stretching my neck and shoulders. That definitely wasn't how I pictured my first werewolf transformation. And the chubby gold wolf, that wasn't how I'd been picturing Lily. Nolan went over to a wall mirror at the far end of the room and began straightening his tie. "Look," he said, facing the mirror, "something you should learn right away." His voice sounded a little different. It felt even more serious than before. Things are a certain way out there in the public, he said. But that's just a show we put on. Nolan cleared his throat and wiped his mouth with his hand. He finished with his tie, but stood at the mirror, staring at himself. This isn't a fairy tale, he continued. I'm not about to fall in love with a commoner. Everything I said out there is true, though. Finally, he turned to face me. I owe you my life, he said. And I took something from you. I must repay you. And how exactly is it? I asked. That you're going to repay me? He frowned at me. You saved my life, he said again. In turn, I can give you a better life. That stung a bit. A better life, I asked. What I'm offering you, he replied. Thousands of women would give anything to have. Well, I happen to like my life, I said, rising from my seat. You do? He asked quietly. His tone was icy. You like being poor. He turned away. Again. If that's all this is to you, I said, repaying a debt or doing damage control because you feel bad for screwing me, then I don't want it. Nolan stopped breathing. He turned around slowly. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not going to marry you. I blinked at him calmly, feeling steely with confidence. It felt good to challenge him. His confidence wavered just a little. I saw it. I had managed to surprise him. I'm sure he wasn't used to being rejected. There's more, he said quietly. He brought his eyes to mine again. They were serious as ever. It's not just that our night together was your first time. It was also mine. I wasn't sure how to respond. Not that I didn't believe him. I just hadn't thought about it from his perspective yet. I guess this is the right thing to do, he continued. We'll be married. His tone was firm but cool. My eyes flicked instinctively to the door. For a moment, I kind of felt like running away again. But Nolan was giving me his undivided attention now. And something about that felt good. I couldn't help it. I kept thinking about that night in the cave. The shockwaves of pleasure the stranger sent through me. The primal sounds he made. It was hard to reconcile. That memory with the man I saw before me now. I remembered the feeling of his strong arms wrapped around me, his big hands on my hips, his hot breath on my neck, and his big dick. He seemed to have a good idea how to use it. Wait, I said, snapping myself back to reality. Were you really a virgin before that night? Yes, he replied flatly. Seemed like. You knew what you were doing. He raised his eyebrows. Are you complimenting me? His mouth twitched, resisting a smug smile. I hadn't really meant to do that. All right, he said. If that's the case, then what's the problem? I would guess that he gestured to the laurel crown, which he'd set aside, having missed the opportunity to put it on my head during the ceremony, is the best offer you may ever receive. I cleared my throat and said, Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. I stepped over to the crown and reached out to touch it. The gold was hard, cold, and heavy. The edges of the leaves were sharp and delicate. It was gorgeous. Because I'm a big girl, I said. I'll never find another handsome man to marry. I'm supposed to just let you sweep me off to the palace where you can fuck me when you feel like it. And I'm supposed to be happy with that, even though you'll never love me. His eyes widened. I coughed out an airy laugh, shrugged, and smiled. I don't need that, I said. I don't need to be Luna. Nolan opened his mouth to speak, but I kept going before he could interrupt me. You said you were grateful for I saved you. Well, I enjoyed myself that night, and that's enough for me. You don't owe me anything else. Nolan narrowed his eyes at me. There was that little spark of danger in them. It was awful how badly I wanted him, especially when he locked eyes with me like that, and let a little of his darkness show through. I reminded myself of what he'd said. What he said, I should really learn right away, that he will never fall in love with me. There was no good reason to let myself give in to him. My stomach felt hollow. I was aching to get home, to eat a hot meal, lie in bed, just be done with this whole awful night. Do you really need to marry for love? Nolan asked. Yeah, I replied, realizing as I said it that this wasn't actually something I'd given much thought before. It's a nice idea, he said, but people fall out of love just as quickly as they fall into it. Marriage is a choice. Love isn't necessary. He stepped closer to me and leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath. He reached his hand out toward my face and touched my double chin. It felt like he wanted me to swat his hand away, or get angry or insecure. Marrying for love is just as good a reason as any other, I said. And I can find someone I'm more compatible with anyway. A commoner, maybe even a fat man who cooks for me and doesn't think there's anything wrong with my body. Oh, Nolan said. So you can keep yourself in as low a position in life as possible. He ran his fingertips under my chin, scratching my soft flesh with his rough skin and reminding me of the mix of pleasure and pain his touch could bring. I have a round face and used to be self-conscious about it. Back in high school, the girls called me pizza face, especially since when I got embarrassed, my cheeks turned bright red. Tina says, my face is like a sweet red apple. That one's supposed to be affectionate. You're taunting me, I said coolly, meeting the prince's stare. My mother once told me I shouldn't waste my time with anyone who doesn't make me happy. I could tell that he understood me. His eyes were still hard and impenetrable, like the surface of a frozen lake, but his heart was pounding. I watched his pulse thrumming away in the big artery in his neck. Now, if you don't mind, I said, clearing my throat, I'm late for dinner with my family. Am I free to go, Your Royal Highness? He was pretty good at hiding his emotions. But I was on to him. Mom had been right, of course. I wasn't using her as an excuse. She knew what she was talking about. I couldn't sell out for the cash, or whatever other reason a girl might have for deciding to throw away everything to run off with a prince. I needed to wait for the real thing, real love with someone who'd let me know him and who wanted to know me. Real love wouldn't be like a fairy tale either. It would be work, and passion, and heartache, and bliss, sometimes worth it, and sometimes maybe not. But I wasn't ready to sign on for a life that promised no love at all. Nolan and I had something electric between us. Maybe it was just sexual chemistry, and a trauma bond formed the night we both almost died. But he was cold, uncaring, and emotionally unavailable. A long, tense silence passed between us. Finally, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. All right, he said, with the haste of a person trying not to expose their feelings. I'll take you home. Thank you, Your Highness, I replied politely. You're too kind. Sigh. He took me home in a Rolls-Royce limousine. We sat in the very back with what felt like a football field's length of red leather couches between us and the chauffeur up front. The Gamma warriors surrounded the limo in a protective motorcade, leading and following us to Tina's house. I was beyond tired. Nolan got on his phone and started talking to some business associate within seconds of getting into the limo. He was arranging a payment for something. He had paperwork on his lap that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I rested my head on the seat back and let myself doze off. I woke to the sound of chaos. Car doors slamming, voices shouting. We'd come to a stop. Dozens of people were buzzing around outside the limo, knocking on the windows, waiting on the sidewalk outside my house, with cameras pointed at the front door. As I roused, I realized I was no longer leaning my head on the seat, but instead on the prince's shoulder. He was still on the phone, but just listening to some voice chattering on the other end. In my drowsiness and surprise, I jumped back. My head thunked into the roof of the limousine. It hurt a little. But worse was my embarrassment. Nolan, still listening to his call, just looked at me and made a shape with his mouth that looked both amused and embarrassed. "I've got to go," he told the person on the phone, and hung up. He opened the door and went out first. He held the door open for me, turning his broad back to the crowd to create a sort of human shield, so I could step out with a little privacy. The Gamma Warriors kept the media at a short distance, while Nolan walked me up to the house. Again, I became very aware of the disturbing ease with which he slipped into this charade in public, pretending to have affection for me. He kissed me on the forehead. When we reached the door, "You better behave," he whispered in my ear. His face was close to mine, and I felt his breath on my neck. It sent a shiver running down my spine. The reporters, kept at bay on the sidewalk, were snapping away with their cameras and talking loudly into microphones. I turned away and reached for the front door, but he kept pace with me and slipped his arm around my waist. It felt like it belonged there. His hands fit themselves around my curves so naturally. I guess because he knew them. His arms were so strong. Every muscle along the whole length of them bulged. He smelled like pine and sandalwood, like he'd just stepped out of the forest. I remembered the smell from the morning after our night together in the cave, but no. I had to stop letting my thoughts drip down into that memory. Every time, it made me feel like I was melting. Every time I thought about the feeling of his hot, rough hands all over every inch of my body. The way he'd fucked me, shameless and giving and desperate and wild. His incredible strength, the way he'd thrown me around, like I was weightless. Just then, one of his attendants appeared beside us and saved me from myself, snapping me out of the daydream. The man handed me a golden business card with only 2 lines on it, Nolan's name and a phone number. I looked up and saw the 2 men pacing away together, leaving me standing there alone without a word of goodbye. Tina had kept a dinner plate warm for me in the oven. She brought it out and let me eat for just a minute before Evan and Peter joined us, and I had to start explaining everything. The events of the past week had all happened so fast. I told my family everything, summing it up as briefly as I could. Evan, who'd changed into sweatpants and a big gray football sweatshirt, paced around the kitchen chewing on a big chunk of beef jerky. He wouldn't make eye contact with me. Tina and Peter sat across from me at the kitchen table. Of course, Evan had already told his parents what happened at the ball. I told them all about the weekend, when Nolan and I first met. Then about how I'd refused the prince's proposal. I added that though I'd refused him, he didn't really seem to be about to give up. He appeared to be very persistent. "You can't do this, Yenna." Evan was the first to speak. He was standing in a corner of the kitchen now, leaning on the counter and fidgeting his leg compulsively. His jaw was set in a hard line. "This guy showed you who he was the first time you met him," he said. "You want to marry someone who treats women like that. Who treated you like that?" Tina sighed. "Evan's not wrong, sweetie. I know he's a prince, but he doesn't sound like a good man." She came around and gave me a hug. It felt nice after everything I'd just been through. "You have a family here that loves you," she said. "I know we're not related by blood, but this is your home. You belong here with us." Looking into her eyes, I knew she was right. It felt so wonderful to be back here, with a warm meal in my stomach, and people telling me they cared about me. So why was I even thinking about leaving this all behind? Yes, I told Nolan I would not marry him, but I'd also been running my fingers over the sharp edges of his gold business card in my pocket while I sat and talked with my family, thinking about what I might say if I called him. But running off with the prince wasn't just about moving out of Tina's house. It meant not coming home for dinner, not even every once in a while. It meant living far away and having a bunch of strangers telling me what to do every day. It meant every single part of my life would change. This life would be over. I hugged Tina and tried not to cry, but I couldn't help it. She really had been a mother to me for many years. Maybe she actually took care of me a little too well. After all, I was 18 now. I was a proper adult, but I still woke up to the smell of pancakes and bacon every morning, and let her serve me cookies hot from the oven every night. Our family will stick together, Tina said. Evan and I came up with a plan. She told me her idea. She wanted Evan to take me to the human world. If Nolan tried to track me down, surely he would not follow me there. And since Nolan was under pressure to marry soon, if we waited a few months, he'd find another Luna, and then we could safely return home. It didn't seem like a great plan to me, for many reasons, but I was tired of arguing with everyone. I told her we should talk more about it in the morning. Finally, Peter spoke. He'd been completely silent all night. I guess I should have noticed that was strange. But honestly, at that point I was just trying to stay awake. Trying to get through this mess of a day and figure out how to steal away for a moment of peace alone. I'm sorry, he started. But there's something I need to tell all of you. He cleared his throat. We all looked at him and waited. His hands were trembling a little. I thought about how distracted he'd been lately. And now, he was sitting there with a tormented expression on his face, looking like he was ready to reveal some terrible secret. I slept like a log, but only for a few hours. The house was active all night. I woke in the morning to voices, phones ringing, and footsteps stomping up and down the stairs. Peter had told us everything. His company had mishandled some money. They took on more debt than they could repay, and got so far underwater. They were all facing criminal charges. If they couldn't make their creditors whole soon, his attorney had called him after the incident at the full moon ball to warn him that they knew his daughter had been selected to marry the prince, and they were threatening now to have Peter and his partners arrested as early as the next day. If Peter didn't take his new riches and repay the entire company's debt immediately. Tina had been furious. She yelled at Peter, cried, then yelled at him some more before sending me and Evan upstairs. I don't know what happened after that. I took my exit without question and passed out as soon as my head hit the pillow. I went downstairs in the early morning, too strung out to sleep in, with all the events of the past 24 hours swirling in my mind. I found Evan and Tina talking in the kitchen drinking coffee. The room felt heavy. Then Peter walked in from the living room. Hanging up a call, he looked at me, then nervously over to Tina. She turned her back to us and began to fix me a cup of coffee in my favorite mug. Yana, Peter said, I need to ask for your help. I sat down. I already knew where we were going, but I let him choke it out. Do you think you could ask the prince if he will help us? He rubbed his hands together, trying to stop them from shaking. You stop right there, Tina said. She put my coffee down on the table in front of me, a little too hard. A blob of whipped cream slid off the top and started melting down the side. Peter, you are not going to sell our daughter to settle a debt, she said, staring daggers at him. It's okay, I said, and I reached out to Tina. She pulled away. It's not okay, Evan snapped. I already had the gold business card and my cell phone in my hand. It's actually my choice, all right, I said. That got them to quiet down. I made the call. While it rang, I took a few shallow breaths and tried to prepare what I was going to say. I didn't plan to, but when the line picked up, I just started talking before the prince could answer. The words just rushed out. "Hello, Nolan. I mean, Your Highness. I changed my mind and I'm so sorry about what I said last night. If you'll still have me, I'll marry you. But I'll need your help with something first, and I just have to get it out. I need $10 million today." I ran out of breath and gulped for air. I pressed the phone to my ear and waited. My brain ran through a bunch of different ways he might respond to that, all in the span of about 2 seconds. But it wasn't Nolan's voice that answered. It was his secretary. "Hello," the man said, "all business?" "The prince is occupied at the present moment, but I will convey your message to him later today." "Ah," I said, both relieved and mortified. I just said all that to someone other than Nolan. "Okay, thank you." I hung up. I couldn't imagine how the prince would receive this message. Tina was standing behind me with her arms crossed, still glaring at Peter. Peter looked exhausted and a bit more gray than usual, like he'd aged 10 years in the past 12 hours. Even was back in the corner of the kitchen, leaning on the counter, sullen and silent. I set the phone down on the kitchen table, drank my coffee, and waited. 10-20 yen. Nolan. The prince was holding a lot inside. Even more than usual. He was lying to everyone, including himself, the story he had prepared to explain this very unexpected decision. It had nothing to do with the truth, but he kept telling it, first, to the crowd at the full moon ball. Then to the girl alone, and again, over and over to himself. His wolf, Kent, had been speaking to him lately for the first time in years. Nolan's father, the king, told him long ago that young lichens heard the voices of their wolves, loud and clear in their minds, when they were first getting used to turning. The wolf's voice faded with time as the two sides of the soul intertwined. But it could come back if it had something important to say. Nolan was not yet able to acknowledge the message he was hearing. He was trying to block it out of his mind, distract himself. The fact was, he didn't really want to get married at all, but it was something he had to do. And soon. And then, Yena, the girl, came to him like a miracle and brought him back from the dead. She had done something to him. Something unexplainable. The sex was not only hot, it also actually healed his injuries. That was the first incredible thing. But that part, amazing as it was, did have an explanation. It was a kind of magic. One the prince had heard of, but thought was extinct. An ancient sort of sexual power, something only wolves descended from a very rare noble bloodline were capable of. Kent was hungry for that power. He wanted to smell her again, taste her, and Kent insisted that this wolf was his fated mate. She was destined to be his Luna. Nolan had years of practice controlling Kent, unrestrained. The wolf was a savage beast. The great work of the prince's entire life so far had been taming this animal inside of him, keeping it at bay and trying to live the life of a good man, a good prince who would someday be a good king. Yena was too young anyway to recognize a fated mate to the public. Nolan used this fact to justify denying the truth of it himself, but if keeping Kent's impulses under control was the only thing at issue, maybe Nolan could have forgotten about Yena. But it was not just his wolf that craved hers. Despite trying very, very hard not to, the prince actually liked the girl. And when he was around her, she drew him to her, like a magnet. He tried not to let his thoughts to linger on this topic. For long, he did not like it. He felt powerless around Yena, and it made no sense. She was not the type of girl he usually found attractive. His ex, Gina. That was his type. Thin, athletic, conventionally pretty and submissive. But everything about Yena was surprising. And she might have been the only woman he had ever met, aside from his own mother, who did not seem to fear him at all. He could not intimidate her. It was annoying, actually, and the couple times he had been near her. It was odd. He tried to keep his hands off her, but he kept reaching out and touching her without thinking, like a reflex. "I'll see you next time, my lord," Leo called out as he headed out of the fencing room. Nolan nodded at him. Fencing had kept his mind off Yena for a little while, but thoughts of her were just rushing back now. Yena did not know yet that Nolan was her fated mate. The girl hardly knew anything about being a werewolf at all. He certainly did not plan on trying to talk to her about this. She had made it quite clear that she was not interested in him. That was hard to swallow. Rejection like that, bold, unapologetic, and personal, was a new experience for Nolan. It gave him a strange discomfort in his chest as he thought about it. He pulled off his fencing jacket and started to strip down, unbuttoning a sweaty undershirt and peeling it off his muscular chest. He wiped his face with a dry spot on the hem, slicking off a film of sweat. A maid entered with a pitcher of cool water and poured him a glass. He became aware that she was staring at his body. He politely pretended not to notice. His secretary came in after her. "Your Highness, I just received a call from Miss Yena," he reported. "She says she needs your help." "How much does she want?" Nolan asked. He sipped his water. "She asked for the same amount we had already prepared after our initial investigation into the adoptive father," the secretary said. $10 million. The total sum of his company's debt. "Write the check," the prince said, "and get the car ready. The heroine is currently facing a difficult situation and needs your support. Please leave your words of encouragement for her in the comments section." Yena. We hid out in the house all morning. Peter had been taking calls from his lawyer, his partners, and his creditors. He told them he was doing everything he could, but that he needed more time. Then they showed up at the house. Evan went around and locked all the doors. Tina pulled the curtains closed over every window. Men were knocking on the door non-stop, banging it hard, trying to wear us down, get us to open up. Peter told us not to be scared. "They'll go away," he said, "if we ignore them." I was pretty sure he was wrong about that, though I really couldn't guess what would happen if we just kept on hiding there in the dark. Peter turned his phone off. He hadn't told anyone the whole story yet. Hopefully, no one besides us and the prince knew yet that I'd rejected his proposal. Not that anyone would believe it anyway if we told them. How could an ordinary girl, a commoner, and a fat girl at that, not take the prince up on such an undeserved offer? I stared at the phone, hoping it would ring any minute now. I was full of regret. I'd only been thinking about myself the night before, what I wanted or didn't want. And Nolan was just so infuriating, so condescending. He made me want to fight and argue against everything he said and did, and put him in his place. Then again, I didn't even know about Peter's situation last night. Now that I knew, it was clear I had to accept the proposal. Peter and Tina took me in and took care of me when my mother died, and I'd been left with no one else in the world. Now, I had to step up and take care of them. Evan was missing practice this morning. My design project, due in an hour, was sitting upstairs on my desk unfinished. I was starting to think it was all over with Nolan. He was actually going to ghost me, just because I'd wounded his delicate ego. I'd blown a chance of a lifetime, but then the commotion outside roared into what sounded like a riot. There must have been 100 people out there, maybe more, all going wild. I recognized a few voices, our neighbors, yelling at us out their windows, demanding to know what was going on. From the street, a car horn sounded, blasting out a series of loud honks as it rolled up to the house, parting the sea of creditors, reporters, and onlookers who were swarming around. Sarah, the family maid, came rushing out from a back room, where I realized she'd been hiding out quietly, trying to keep out of our way throughout the morning's chaos. "It's the prince," she said. Rushing to the front window, she threw the curtain open, letting in a blinding blast of sunlight. And she was right. There was the shiny black Rolls-Royce limousine, flanked by the Gamma Warrior motorcade of matte black SUVs. Evan appeared at my side. Our eyes were glued on the scene unfolding outside. Tina, who'd been so stubbornly fixed on her anger with Peter for hours now, stood behind us to watch as Nolan stepped gracefully out of the limo. She whispered, almost inaudibly, "Oh goddess, it really is him." She put her arm through mine. I looked at her and saw tears pooling in her eyes. All the attention outside now was on Nolan. No one was trying to snap photos of us through the windows. They were all over the prince, clamoring to edge past the attendants and guards that kept him in a protective bubble. Nolan's secretary zeroed in on the creditors and found the person in charge. He opened a thin briefcase and produced an envelope that he handed over quickly. It was unbelievable how fast it happened. The man opened the envelope, examined the check, shook hands with the secretary, and then he and every last one of his associates got in their cars and drove away. Just like that, the secretary beat Nolan to the front door. Evan let him in, and he sat down with Peter at the kitchen table. I heard them whispering from the other room. Another $50 million. The prince signed a second check, just to give to my parents. I'd never seen Peter cry before. But as he thanked the secretary, I heard in his voice what sounded like the warble of a person in tears. It must have been such a relief for him. A total turnaround from the state of our lives just an hour before. Then the secretary asked to speak with me privately. We went into another room, and he told me I needed to pack my things. I was leaving with them in a few minutes and moving into the palace today. I knew I didn't have any choice. And anyway, it was probably better not to prolong the goodbyes. Tina and Sarah helped me pack. I said goodbye to everyone quickly and walked out to the limo, surrounded by guards who'd been waiting at the door to escort me through the crowd. The prince lingered in the house a moment longer. The chauffeur took my bags and loaded them into the trunk. I put my hand on the door handle but couldn't open it. I turned around and saw Tina, who'd come out of the house and was standing on the porch watching me, still wearing her pink bathrobe over her pajamas. I ran back to her for one last hug. We cried for a minute, and then the prince came and touched my arm, telling me it was time to leave. Thou ain't. Nolan thought about waiting in the limo for Yana, but the mob of reporters would not go away. So he went into the house for a few minutes while the girl finished packing her belongings. She came down the stairs with her luggage, crying. He wasn't used to seeing women in such a vulnerable state. It repulsed him, a little, and a cruel impulse deep inside of him also wanted to laugh at her weakness. But instead, he asked his secretary to bring the girl a handkerchief. The handkerchief was silk, rose pink, and embroidered with royal emblems stitched in gold thread. She wiped her eyes and blew her nose, then said some hasty goodbyes and fled out the door. Her mother paced after her, stepping out onto the porch and pausing there. Nolan took a step toward the door. The girl's cheeks had been flushed, making her round face look like a red apple. Somehow, even that attracted him to her. He wanted to reach out and stroke her soft cheeks. Kiss her, take a bite out of her. Nolan felt eyes on him and looked to his left. Evan, Yena's adoptive brother, was standing a few feet away with his fists clenched and a murderous look in his steely blue eyes. The prince looked at Evan with cold, calm disdain. He knew there was something going on with this young wolf, with him and Yena. "You better treat her well," Evan said. "You have no idea how special that girl is. You have no idea how amazing and beautiful she is, and if you ever hurt her, I don't care if you're the fucking king by then, I swear I'll come after you with everything I've got." Nolan smiled at the boy. His threat was irritating, but not frightening. "You like her, don't you?" Nolan asked quietly. "Your little sister, you want her." Evan's face flushed, going beet red. "My relationship with Yena," he said, "is none of your business." Nolan knew full well what kind of relationship Evan wanted with Yena. He could smell it. It almost made him laugh to think that the boy actually felt he was fooling anyone. The way he followed his sister around, watching her every move, Nolan's blood felt hot. It gave him a tight, unpleasant feeling in his chest. Thinking about Yena and Evan, he took a step toward the door. Yena was still standing there on the porch, in an embrace with her adoptive mother, oblivious to the conversation taking place inside. The prince turned back to Evan and looked him dead in the eye. "Why is it," Nolan asked, "that you are so obsessed with her?" Evan was silent for a few seconds. The two stared each other down, neither one flinching. "Yena," Evan finally said, "is the most beautiful girl in the world to me. If you can't see that, if you can't see how amazing she is, then let her stay here with me." Nolan arched an eyebrow, amused, and asked, "You think I would marry a woman I don't think is beautiful?" Evan's eyes widened. Maybe that would help stomp out the young wolf's ambition to steal Yena away from him. Nolan turned away and stepped out on the porch. He touched the girl's arm and told her it was time to go. "Syed." "Yena." Tina was fully crying now, as the prince pulled me from her arms. I had told her too much. I shouldn't have spilled about what Nolan had said after the ball. I wouldn't have if I'd thought then that there was any chance I was actually going to marry him. Tina worried about me all the time no matter what. But now, she felt like her husband had just sold me off to a man who didn't care about me at all. I know she thought he would treat me badly. I wanted to show her I wasn't afraid of Nolan. To try to let her know I was going to be okay. So I stood on my tiptoes and kissed the prince on the cheek to try to show her we were all right together. I slipped my small hand into Nolan's as well. He allowed me to, but I felt a tension in his grip and started to realize he didn't like what I was doing. He kept hold of my hand until we reached the limo, cooperating with the bit I'd started. When we got inside, he looked me in the eye and admonished me. I was never to touch him again without his permission, he said. In public, in private, or otherwise. I laughed. I wasn't afraid of him. The way he kept trying to reprimand me was getting to be a little funny. I felt Lily waking up inside me. She smelled Nolan and got my heart started beating faster. But the prince sat far away from me in the limo this time and kept himself occupied with more business calls and paperwork. He didn't even look at me again until we arrived at the palace. It was exactly what I had expected. Sheer opulence. Total luxury. All the furniture and artwork in the palace was ornate, and the sun poured in thick through big windows on every wall, drenching everything with white light. Gold fixtures and frames on the walls glowed like they'd just been forged in fire. The walls were white. The cold marble floors were white. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceilings in every room and hallway. Pearl and abalone bowls sat atop long tables, full of dried rose petals that filled the air with an almost rotten, sickeningly sweet aroma. Big white couches and chairs we gathered together into little sitting areas in all the various rooms, all tufted and absurdly fluffy. My luggage looked hilarious, sitting at the end of the bed in the room where I'd been set up temporarily. In my own home, my belongings looked normal. Just used. Here, they looked like garbage. The huge bed before me had a big, thick white comforter on it that looked like an actual cloud. Every object in the room was so clean. A deaconess came in and introduced herself. I didn't need to tell her much. She looked at my open suitcase and smiled at me. She'd bring me a change of clothes, she said, and she told me to go and get washed up while I waited for her to return. I was surprised to find the deaconess trying to haul off with my suitcase when I got back after taking a shower. "Stop!" I shouted at her. She was a bit stunned and set the suitcase down on the floor. "I brought you fresh clothes, though, like I told you," she said. "I'll wear them," I replied. "But that doesn't mean I have to throw away everything I own. My mother bought me those clothes." My voice trailed off. It was interesting that I called Tina my mother. I felt like I was seeing and appreciating that woman more than ever today, having had to leave her behind. The deaconess was not happy. "But you'll never wear them again," she argued. "Tell me, what is the harm in keeping them anyway?" I snapped. "Tell me." Finally, she backed down and left me be. The room I was given was mine alone. I went in and pushed the big double doors closed and locked them behind me. It felt good to be alone at last. I wouldn't move into a bedroom to share with Nolan until after we were married. It still seemed surreal, even then, while I lay flat in the cloud bed, looking up at a ceiling covered with tiles made of paper-thin gold foil. It didn't seem real. The deaconess brought some dinner to my room, leaving it for me atop a folding table she brought in and set up beside the bed. I ate and relaxed a little. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd been able to do that. Relax. I fell asleep wrapped up in the white comforter, but didn't nap for long. The sun was almost finished setting when I woke up. I changed into some of my new clothes. I had to admit they were really lovely. The fabrics were incredible. The silks were softer than any I'd ever felt before. I crept out of my room and walked around a little, planning to familiarize myself with my new home. The halls were creepy quiet, and now that there was no more sunlight pouring in through the big windows, it was uncomfortably dark and full of long, strange shadows. I turned a corner and bumped into Nolan. He was damp and naked, except for a fluffy white towel wrapped around his waist. I felt my body respond. I stepped closer to him, unable to take my eyes off his broad chest. I remembered the feeling of running my fingers through the rough patch of hair in the center of it. "You're drooling, fat girl," he said, his mouth twitching into a smile. Yena, on some sort of embarrassed impulse. I actually reached up to my mouth and wiped it with my hand. There was no drool. I felt my face get hot. It was unbelievable. He had such a skill for pushing my buttons and could do it so fast. He took one step forward and leaned against the doorframe. We were face to face at a sort of four-way intersection of dark, empty hallways. Nolan was tall and broad and cast a shadow that enveloped me in darkness. "Stop fucking with me," I said. "Well," he replied, "you were the one-eye fucking me first." The dim moonlight drifting in through the windows hit his eyes and lit them up. They were hard like stone, deep green in shadow, and staring down at me with the prince's signature brand of smoldering condescension. A rush of desperate desire surged through me, starting at my throat and flooding downwards. I swallowed as quietly as I could and thought about turning around. I couldn't give him the satisfaction of being rewarded for this kind of behavior. Lily growled in my mind. "He smells so good," she was whispering. This I could not argue against. "He's ours," Lily said. "He is our fate." I shook my head and lifted one foot, dragging it back slowly to step out of Nolan's shadow. "Give in," Lily said. "Just look at him, and he's all yours. Remember, the first time he can do that to you again." "Shut up," I shouted, out loud. On accident, of course. I wanted Lily to shut up. But I'd shouted that out loud to the future king of the werewolf nation. "What did you just say to me?" he asked in that flat, emotionless tone he liked to use to reprimand me. He took a short step backward. It let a little moonlight pour across the ground. drawing a pale white line between us on the dark marble floor. But then, he took a big stride forward. Our bodies hovered parallel to each other's in a long, tense moment, just an inch apart. "I'm sorry," I found myself whispering. I couldn't get my tongue to form any more words. It was wet. I felt savagely hungry for him. Then he put his warm hand on my neck, pushed his big fingers up over my chin, and ran them through my hair, stopping with a fistful of my blonde curls balled up in the palm of his hand. A hot shiver started my scalp, and then took over my whole body. He released my hair and pulled his hand back. I took a deep breath and exhaled. He was still towering over me. So close, I felt every rise and fall of his chest as he breathed in and out. "Why?" I finally managed to say. "Are you wandering around out here naked anyway? Were you just waiting to seduce me?" My voice wasn't coming out as strong as I'd hoped it would. A breathy whisper was all I could manage. "Don't you have your own bathroom?" I finished. "Yeah," he said. "I do, but I like the one in the tower back here." He gestured down the dark hallway behind him. "It has a big bathtub," he said, "and a view of the sun setting over the forest." "Sure," I said. "I'm sure that's the reason. But since we're here now, do you mind if I reached up and put my hand flat against his chest, right the center of his pecs. His chest hair was still damp from the bath. His skin was clean and boiling hot. And then, once again, in front of this gorgeous man, my body betrayed me. I couldn't control it. I started to turn my hand on his chest. It was turning into a paw, complete with razor-sharp claws. I recoiled. As I pulled away, my claws caught on Nolan's towel. It fell to the floor. I froze. Nolan just pushed off the wall he'd been leaning against, and smiled. My hand was my own human hand again. I know because both my hands flew to my face, and I ran away, fleeing back to my room, before my brain could tell my body that this was also an embarrassing thing to do. Sakwan, Nolan. This girl was really something else. Just when he thought she could not get much stranger, she went and did something like that. At least, Yena's almost insane level of awkwardness often served a useful purpose. It saved him from having to give in to his desire for her, and he needed some help with that, because he wanted her every time he saw her. He needed to get that under control. Control was everything. That was what Nolan's father taught him. Nolan would be the most powerful man in the kingdom soon. One of the most powerful men in the world. Power was what he had been preparing for all his life. He would never be able to control Yena. He had already come to terms with that, but he did enjoy trying to dominate her. It never worked, but in an inexplicable, infuriating way. It was fun, but the way he kept giving in, letting his hands reach out and touch her, even when he knew better, he had to gain control over that impulse. It was the wolf. The wolf he thought he had tamed. Kent was active. Nolan felt him pacing in circles, frustrated. The part of the prince that liked to put other people down, especially commoners, for whom he had always felt a natural dislike, wanted to mock Yena for being so graceless and clumsy. At the thought of this, though, Kent began to growl. "Lying to yourself, you know you want her," the wolf said. "You love the way she touches you. You cannot lie to me." Nolan became aware that he was just standing in the hallway naked, where Yena had left him. He picked up his towel and wrapped it around his waist again. Walking back to his room, he gritted his teeth. He insisted, to the wolf and to himself, that Yena had no control over him. that he did not love her, did not want her. He insisted she was not his fated mate. She was not even his type. The wolf only growled in response and continued pacing, making Nolan's heart beat harder and harder. It was easier not to think about Yena when he kept busy. So the prince went to his study to do some work after getting dressed. There was much to be done anyway. Everything that happened in the past week had been very distracting. It was a little bit of everything. Family duties to fulfill, more events he was supposed to attend than there were hours for in the day, parliamentary briefs to read, news to catch up on, calls awaiting response, decisions to be made. He let himself get lost in his tasks. The moon this night was a thin crescent. The forest outside was one big, black, undulating shadow. Nolan finished his work and stood for a moment at the window, staring out. All he could see was his own reflection, staring back. He passed Yena's bedroom on the way back to his own and paused in front of the big double doors. He felt the urge to go inside and crawl into bed with her. He would never. He started to walk on, but as he did, he heard something. Yena's voice. From behind the door. Nolan. He pressed his ear to the door, but heard nothing further. He knocked. Nothing. Without thinking, he gave the door a little push, and it swung open. Yena was sprawled out in bed with a white bedsheet wrapped tightly around her dramatic curves. She was talking in her sleep. "Evan," she whispered. Nolan tensed. She was dreaming about the boy. The brother. His pulse increased. His heart started hammering away in his chest again. "Where did you put?" Yena continued, her voice soft and sleepy. "The chocolates. Where are my chocolates?" Nolan stifled a laugh. "Greedy girl," he whispered. A breeze drifted through the hall and swept a chill into the bedroom. Yena shivered in her sleep. A quilt was on the floor, in a heap, having fallen off the bed. He waved his hand. It slid back up onto the bed, covering the girl as she slept. Her body relaxed, and her breathing grew steady and quiet. Nolan let himself look at her soft round face for just a moment longer. Then he turned and left. He pulled the doors closed behind him silently. It would have been easy to let the wolf take over. Just a few steps over to the bed. His desire for this girl was truly terrifying. He was not sure what he might be capable of around her. He leaned on the wall beside the door and thought about the shape of her body. All he wanted to do was touch. He went to his bedroom and locked himself inside. Had the cane. Yena. I woke with my stomach growling. I dressed and went downstairs to find a beautiful sight waiting for me in the dining room. A big table full of amazing-looking food, pancakes, fruit, and a little pitcher of syrup, bacon, eggs, and fried tomatoes. I might have been dreaming about this exact meal last night. The room was empty until I sat down, and a maid came in. She poured me a steaming cup of coffee from a gold teapot. As she walked away, I noticed a small dish on the table with a closed lid. I opened, and it found it was full of chocolate truffles. I smiled. This was it. A little delicious luxury that was starting to make the whole princess thing actually sound appealing. When the maid came in again, I asked her if she knew if the prince was around. She said he went to a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new werewolf orphanage. He'd left early before the sun came up. Thank goddess, I thought. I let myself relax and really enjoy the feast in front of me. Everything was amazing. The berries were impossibly fresh. The bacon was crisped to perfection. But even though I finally felt refreshed with some calories, sugar, and caffeine in me, My brain was torturing me, replaying the embarrassing scene from the night before over and over in my mind. I hated Lily. I prayed that Nolan would somehow forget the whole thing. He wouldn't, of course. But maybe he could take it easy on me just this once and at least pretend. Lily felt my anger and promised she'd never try to take me over again without my permission. So at least it wouldn't happen again. I hoped. After breakfast, the deaconess found me. Then my luxurious little moment of peace was over, and she rushed me over to etiquette training in another wing of the palace. Then, it turned into an unpleasant morning. The deaconess's name was Raffaella. She had big round eyes that gave her an appearance of constant urgency. The first thing we did was practice different kinds of bows and curtsies. There were specific ones to use depending on who else was in the room when I saw the Lichen King and Luna Queen. These would be my in-laws, I argued. Couldn't I ever just be myself around them? That made Raffaella's big eyes get even wider. Apparently, my ignorance about royal customs was wildly offensive. After that, she was even meaner and pickier about my performance in the lessons. The last thing I had to do, she said, was get changed for a lunch meeting with Nolan and Luna. I gulped. That would probably not be fun. We went to a changing room, and she brought out a white dress with floral embroidery on the long, flowing sleeves. I was relieved. It looked like it would fit. Raffaella pushed me behind a wooden screen and told me to get undressed while she prepared the dress. I could dress myself, I told her. I'm a grown woman and can put on my own clothes. She started reprimanding me, like everyone here apparently was in the business of doing, when one of the prince's attendants came in through the open door. I guess the deaconess didn't hear the door over her scolding chatter. She jumped when the man stopped right beside her and spoke. I heard the distinct sound of fabric ripping and a gasp. "Oh, goddess," Raffaella whispered, her voice shaky. "What have I done?" I threw my clothes back on and came out from behind the screen. She'd torn the left sleeve, a big long rip through the delicate fabric, starting at the hemline, on the wrist. It was a little alarming to see her get so distressed at the thought of upsetting Luna. Especially since I'd be on my way to see the woman any minute now. This was the woman who raised an arrogant, indifferent prince, a woman who could instill such fear in her servants. They trembled when they made the slightest mistake. "It's okay," I said. "I can fix it." "That's very kind," she said. "But I will tell Luna what happened and accept my punishment." "No," I said. "Really, if you have a pair of scissors and some thread, I'll just change the sleeves a little." She squinted at me and said in a dubious tone, "All right." She got the supplies and talked to the attendant while I worked. I heard him telling her that Nolan was on his way to escort me to the meeting. It only took a minute. I cut both sleeves up to about the elbow and hand-stitched a couple quick loose hems. The fabric was forgiving, and I was able to make some pleats in the sleeves that would actually be more flattering on me. This time, Raffaella did not argue when I told her I was going to dress myself. I changed quickly and came out to find the attendant gone and the deaconess looking me up and down. She bowed her head slightly and said, "Thank you, Miss Yaina. It looks beautiful." I shrugged and said, "It was no problem. This is what I do. I study fashion design, and I'm going to start my own clothing line someday, a luxury plus-size brand." She looked at me with an odd expression. "What is it?" I asked. "I should," she started, faltering. "There are some things you should know, Miss Yaina." "What kind of things?" I asked. "Precautions," she said, "for your time in the palace." The prince returned in the afternoon, having received his mother's summons for a lunch meeting with him and Yaina. He heard voices coming from a room close by. Yaina and the deaconess. He walked over to check in on her lesson. It appeared the morning's training must have been over. The girl was dressing for the meeting already. Nolan checked his watch. He was running late. Apparently, so was Yena. Rafaela was pacing outside a screen. He saw Yena's shadow moving as she changed her own clothes on the other side. Odd, he thought. He wondered how the girl had managed to persuade the deaconess to allow her to do such a thing. Yena emerged in a beautiful dress, and two women spoke quietly. The prince heard Yena say that she was studying fashion design in college and planned to start a clothing line. There were scissors and thread on the bed and some torn strips of fabric. Had Yena just tailored her own gown? It was gorgeous and fit her perfectly. He forced himself to walk away. The girl had ambition. It was impressive. It occurred to him that this was why he had so insulted her the night of the ball. Why she did not care about the prince's promise of wealth and a life of ease. The girl did not care if she was poor and ordinary, because she had a dream and talent. Nolan stepped away. He would come back for Yena in a few minutes. This new information he had just learned. It felt familiar. He had been with his last girlfriend, Gina, for a long time, until she left him for a new life in the human world. He wondered. Now, if Yena could do the same. Nolan pulled out the key to his study and reached for the doorknob. But it swung open before he touched it. The secretary, mid-step on his way out, let out a startled little bleat. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," he said with a small bow. "I've just left some mail on your desk." The prince nodded. The mail was in a pile. A few envelopes, correspondence he'd been expecting, and one postcard. On the front was a glossy photo of a city skyline backlit by a pink sunset. A human city. He flipped it over. "I miss you, Nolan." It read in neat handwriting. "Looking forward to seeing you soon. Yena." Nolan was all business as we went to meet his mother. I couldn't believe he was actually going to let it lie. He didn't tease me about last night at all. But he was again cold and indifferent with me. Given a choice between the two, I'd take the indifference over the taunting any day. We walked a stone bridge over a big open courtyard. It took us almost half an hour. Then the Gamma warriors unlocked a set of heavy stone doors that rolled open to reveal a glass elevator. We rode it to the top. My ears popped as we went up. Adjusting to the altitude, the Lycan Palace had been built into the side of a mountain. The king and queen resided in the very back, in a wing that was, in part, embedded into the actual stone and earthen slope of the mountainside. We stepped out of the elevator into a bright, opulent sitting room. Luna was sitting atop a sort of small throne, looking comfortable and effortlessly beautiful. A delicate golden crown was nestled into her thick black hair, which cascaded down her back and shoulders in loose, shiny waves. She looked up at us and smiled. I followed Nolan's lead and walked behind him over to the queen. He offered her a small bow and greeted her curtly. He stepped aside and gave me a nod. I bowed, Your Highness, I said in as polite a tone as possible. "It's an honor." She paused for an uncomfortably long time. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to stay bowed with my eyes on the floor. I decided to risk it and just step back. I looked her in the eye. She stared back at me. Her deep eyes were a lot like Nolan's, but darker, almost black, with just a tinge of green. "You need to lose weight," she said at last, "so no pleasantries. Then, at least 40 pounds before the wedding." She shifted her gaze over to Nolan. "Your girl is not ready to be a royal bride." Her mouth twisted into a grimace when she looked back at me. "There's nothing wrong with her," Nolan said, to my great surprise. He spoke in the princely tone, diplomatic, calm, and composed. She's beautiful the way she is, he continued. She has rosy cheeks without makeup, and I happen to appreciate her plump figure. He wasn't looking at me. He was talking directly to his mother. I could not believe what was happening. Luna hadn't moved her body once since we walked into the room. She was reclined in the throne, sitting a little bit sideways with a soft pillow behind the arch of her back. She tilted her head and gave Nolan an amused smile. Yena is beautiful, the prince finished. She looks healthy and happy the way she is. I was speechless. Luna looked just a little surprised. She turned her gaze to me and looked me up and down with hard, icy eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler. 20 pounds, she said. Can you do this, Yena? I nodded. Of course, I said, a bit stunned to find myself negotiating anything with a queen. She looked at me like she was waiting for something. Of course, Your Highness, I added. Remembering my morning lesson, her red lips parted in a big smile. Wonderful, she said. That will be all for now. Sentai, wed. Nolan. His mother sent Yena away and invited Nolan to sit down. A servant brought out a bottle of red wine and poured a glass for each of them. I see now, Luna said to him after the servant had gone. There is something special about the girl. She took a sip of wine and asked, Is she your fated mate? Her tone sounded almost disinterested. Yes, Nolan finally admitted. Luna nodded. I was prepared, she said, to dislike her. I was already planning another selection party for you, one you would not ruin, this time, with antics and scandal. Nolan was silent. He knew it was not yet his time to talk. But I have changed my mind, she concluded. We will begin planning the wedding right away. The prince tried to hide his relief. There's something I never told you, she continued. There was a prophecy made the year you were born. It concerned you. And the girl. Nolan set down his glass and sat further back in his chair. The moon goddess sent a message to a prophet, she continued. An old woman who has long since passed. She prophesied that your future Luna would have a rarer and nobler bloodline than even the lichens, and that she would bring you good fortune. Nolan waited as the queen drained the last dregs of wine from her glass. She sat up and retrieved the bottle and poured herself another. Your half-brother, she said, settling back into her comfortable position, has returned. So far he has been quiet. But I am worried. She looked up to the ceiling and sipped her wine. I am worried he will try to fight you for the throne. Nolan felt little surprise at this news. It had always been a possibility that Aiden would come back from the human world and change his mind about denying the throne that had once been rightfully his. But he abdicated. Aiden had no legal right now to challenge Nolan's position in line for the kingship. To do so would be an act of treason. Marry Yena, the queen said flatly. As soon as possible, the prophecy is coming to pass. The girl will bring you luck. She looked Nolan in the eye. I fear, she said, you are going to need it. Nolan sat soaking in a bathtub of scaling hot water, mulling over everything his mother had told him. Out the window, the sun inched into the horizon and vanished into a blue haze. He was lost in thought, oblivious to the time. He kept thinking about Yena's power. How the one night they had sex, he had severely injured. He had been almost dead. He had woken in the cave to the feeling of Yena's fingers sinking into the bleeding wound in his shoulder. He remembered the hot, stabbing pain, but even that touch also felt amazing. Electric, addicting. He knew sex was supposed to feel satisfying. But this was something else. He did not notice right away that he was healing. While they fucked, he had been in a sort of dream state. He had lost a lot of blood and was not in his right mind. The wolf had been the one in control. He held his breath and sunk his head under the surface of the water. He thought about how she was that night. She was like a goddess. She took everything he could give her. He had not wanted to leave her, but he had woken to a glimmer of sunrise and had to flee. He had to get back to the palace before daylight, before he could be seen. Nolan snapped back to the present and rose out of the water, gasping. It had been light out when he drew this bath. Now he was sitting in total darkness, in a tub of lukewarm water. He dried himself and padded back down the hall. He passed Yenna's room. She had left the double doors wide open and was inside, facing away from him in the dim yellow light of a few flickering candles. She was wearing a light dressing gown, and her hair was wet. He wanted to storm into the room and throw her onto the bed, rip her nightgown to pieces, bite into her soft skin. He shook his head. He hated the lack of control he had over these thoughts. Then he heard a snarling growl in the back of his mind. Then Kent's voice laughing.